Up next, let's talk about why we use fifths and octaves so much within bass parts. From the safety of how they sound, to the ease of playability, to the math that just makes them make sense. Let's break things down a bit. Now first, it's important to mention that when a sound plays, there's a vibration going through the air that is oscillating up and down at different frequencies. In other words, is it a slow up and down? Is it a fast oscillation, a fast up and down? This is what we know as frequency, and it's represented in hertz. In other words, cycles per second. In 1 second, is there one up and down, one oscillation, or is there 1,000? One oscillation would be 1 hertz, 1,000 oscillations in a second would be 1 kilohertz. So this is how we talk about the frequency spectrum, whether we are considering how to tune a piano or working with an EQ and visually understanding where certain frequency landmarks are. It's important to understand what frequency is all about. Now, as you may or may not know, the bass guitar is not notoriously known for playing chords. If you start to play chords on any instrument, as you move lower and lower and lower, there's more conflict between the notes. Think of the notes like beams of light. As you get lower, the beams of light get thicker. Now, we don't want to overlap the beams of light, but we also don't want huge gaps between them necessarily when we're playing chords. So if you think about a chord that's really, really high up on the piano, it's very thin and brittle. It's like 3 lasers with lots of separation between them. It just doesn't quite feel connected in terms of the light. Down low on the piano, you play a chord, it sounds grumbly. All these fat laser beams are overlapping one another. But you play towards the middle of the piano and you get these beams of light that are medium thick and sort of end up just sort of touching the edge of one another. That's sort of the sweet spot of harmony. But again, when we move down quite low, everything is sort of overlapping each other. The sounds are bullying one another and it's just too much happening in one space. So generally, we don't really play chords on bass. But when we think about how the math of frequencies work, if I'm playing, for example, this note here, which is an A, and then I play an A 1 octave higher, what I have is double the frequency. Let's say this A is A 440, 440 cycles per second. If I go down 1 octave to an A below it, now I have A 220. It is half the frequency of 440. And if I go up an octave, it works the same. Now I have A, which is the note, 880, 880 hertz. So part of the reason octaves are forgiving on bass is that you could play 2 A's together. They're separated enough that the sounds aren't overlapped and conflicting, and the math just works out really well. But outside of the math of things, quite honestly, you're not usually playing an octave harmonically, like at the same time on bass. It's just a safe note choice. If the chord is a C major chord, playing a C is safe. So playing any other C is going to be generally safe. Now, I say safe in terms of the note will sound decent, but you also have to consider the role of the bass. Should I be playing a C and then a C 3 octaves higher on the bass? Well, no, now I'm encroaching into the territory of singers and other instrumentalists. But generally, if you're staying in that low range of the bass, it's fine to play octaves. What's cool is once you get the idea of here's my note A and here's an A 1 octave higher, now you can just play around with rhythms using those 2 notes. It's just 2 notes, but as soon as you introduce that second note, now you can start to introduce a lot more in terms of groove and different patterns. So I would say if a chord progression goes D minor, G minor, A, try playing a lot of Ds, Gs, and As by themselves, and then try Ds as octaves, Gs as octaves, and As as octaves. That might sound something like this. So I'm down here on this D, maybe just a... There's the G up to the A. Just like a kind of chunky rock sort of part where we're just going do, 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 just on one note. But if I get playing octaves, now I have sounds like... Now I'm starting to create much more groove, even just by introducing that second note. So the math works really well. They're simple in terms of playing patterns, but there's one other note that's really important. And again, you notice that when we play one note, there's only so much we can do with the rhythm. I mean, a real bassist on a real instrument with all the nuance they can introduce will tell you there's plenty I can do with one note. But when we're working on keys and when we're creating these parts, generally it's nice to have more than one note available per chord. So on a D minor chord, I don't want to be forced just to play only one D. But this octave, yes, it's important. There's another note though that we can introduce, and again, this opens up the stylistic patterns we can play considerably, and that is the fifth. Whatever key you're in, whatever scale you're playing within, the fifth note, so if we're in D minor, D, E, F, G, A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that A is a very important note because not only is it going to be part of that D minor chord, but it also sort of bridges this octave. D to D is a very wide distance. What if we had some note that can kind of help us bridge between those Ds? Well, in this case, the fifth, A, is a super solid choice. Now, in terms of frequency, you'll notice when I play two Ds together, it almost just sounds like one note. It just sounds like a thicker version of D. Here's the low D, here's the high D, here's both. It just sounds like a thick version of it. If I now play D and then the fifth A, and then play them together, you'll see it still sounds pretty decent. Here's D, here's A, here they are together. There's a little bit of dissonant sort of wobble, but for the most part, it sounds pretty consonant. It sounds pretty fine. If I bring it up an octave, it sounds even better. So it's going to sound a bit thicker than an octave because the notes are closer together. And in terms of the math, basically what you're getting is a 2-to-3 ratio. While this bottom D oscillates 2 times, this A in the same duration of time will oscillate 3 times. Mathematically, it sounds kind of problematic, but it's really not. 2 and 3 actually work pretty well mathematically. They both are divisible by 6. We work with 2s a lot in music and 3s a lot just in terms of time signatures. But what's interesting is if you slow down the vibration of the 2 and 3 enough, you actually hear a rhythm. And this experiment was done inversed by Jacob Collier, where he was playing some sort of rhythm. Let's say I'm just slapping it on my chest. It's a 2-against-3 rhythm. And if you speed it up enough, eventually you hear this interval of a fifth. So this rhythm I can't go fast enough because I'm human, but if you do it really, really, really quickly, then you start to hear that fifth form. So even from the basic rhythm, the beats that create those notes, it's very fundamental. So our fifth, D to A in this case, and our octave, D to D, super important intervals to be working with on bass. I've played with enough bassists to know that even beginner bassists will often start with this stuff because it's safe. What chords are you playing on guitar? A minor, E minor? Okay, I'll play A and E. Now I'm a bit more adventurous, let's try octaves, just more A's and more E's. And now that fifth can help me bridge between those areas, and it's also a safe note that you're going to find within the chord. Now when I say you'll find it within the chord, I'm talking about basic chords. If the chord is called minor 7 flat 5 or something like that, now they've changed that fifth, so you have to be careful. I don't want to dive too deep into the theory at this point because everything can start to intersect really quickly, but the idea is on most major chords, minor chords, dominant 7th chords, major 7th and minor 7th chords, root 5th octave, very safe choices. Now that we have this fifth available, let's see how that might change the bass part a little bit. It might sound something like this. Now there's all these notes dancing all over the place, but we're just kind of stuck in these patterns of root 5th octave, root 5th octave, root 5th octave, and noodling around in those positions. Generally playing the low root first, and then experimenting with these upper notes rhythmically. The other thing to mention is that a major chord or a minor chord has a root, a third, and a fifth. We're playing the root and the fifth, but we're not really playing the third. Part of the reason, as I mentioned, is it's too close to the root and fifth that if you do end up playing notes together, it just sounds muddy. But also bass parts generally dance around tonality a little bit. In other words, the guitar and the piano and the singer are going to help outline the majorness or the minorness of the song, arguably, more than the bassist. So the root 5th octave isn't actually touching the part of the chord that makes it sound major, or the part of the chord that makes it sound minor. We're kind of dancing around neutral territory and just really creating a solid foundation. If major or minor sort of colors the sound, we want to think of that like a house. The bass is like the foundation for your house. How fancy do you want the foundation of your house to be? You don't need it to be fancy. Really, you just need it to be foundational and really supportive, and that is generally the role of a bassist. Now, as bass players progress in their careers, they may have more of a role that is up front. Someone like Victor Wooten is not always laying down the most simple bass parts. He can play melodies, he can play chords, but that is generally not the role of the bass, and you have to be very nuanced in the way you approach something like that. And just to be clear, I talked about the math of an octave being double the frequency and a fifth being like a 2-to-3 ratio. A tritone, which is one note lower than the fifth, so up 6 semitones from your first note, has a ratio of 1.414 to 1. Mathematically, that's a nightmare. And you can hear this sound. Sounds kind of like a nightmare. So the math between notes and how fast they vibrate and how those vibrations interact with each other is very important. And although bass isn't always playing chords, it still keeps this relationship between notes in mind. Now, what I'm not saying is that a bassist can never play the third of a chord. I think as a starting point, we want to have roots and then octaves and then fifths as a solid foundation, and then we can start to play around a little bit more with introducing thirds. In our next class, we are going to be talking about outlining thirds within our bass parts, so let's jump over there, add some more notes that we can play around with to help the rest of the band outline the major or the minor of the song. In other words, the tonality. I'll catch you in that next class.